Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about using native plants to attract all kinds of critters, birds, bees, butterflies, and other beneficials. But just a few words about me before I jump right into the content. So I'm with the OSU, Ohio State University Department of Entomology, the bug department, and I'm an all outreach educator. So I have an extension appointment and I teach across the state, focusing on pollinator education. I used to be a county extension educator in the Stark and Summit areas, counties, which is the Akron-Canton area, if you're familiar with Ohio, where my focus was horticulture and integrated pest management. I coordinated master gardeners and volunteer naturalists and did a lot of programming for the commercial horticulture industry and also consumer horticulture. So have a real strong plant background. I was asked to come over about 10 years ago to the Department of Entomology to give lead to the pollinator education program. So tonight we're going to talk about all these different critters, how they benefit from native plants, what we can do to, how we can incorporate these plants and this habitat into our own landscapes, whether it's a few pots on the patio, a community garden plot, or you have a several acres. So we're going to try to talk about some practical steps that everyone can take. And so we're going to talk about lots of different kinds of animals. My focus is primarily pollinators. I spent a lot of time talking about pollinators, specifically bees, wild bees. Here in Ohio, we have we're not sure exactly how many, but about 450 species of bees. So a lot of bee diversity. If you think about that, honeybees are one species. We have about 12 species of bumblebee. And then, 400 and some other species of bees. So a lot of bee diversity. I'm going to widen that lens a little bit tonight, and we're going to talk about some of the other beneficial insects that are out there, butterflies and moths, wasps, flies, and then we'll talk a little bit about hummingbirds, primary pollinator, our bird pollinator in Ohio. So many of us owe our interest and love for native plants and kind of the enthusiasm behind the urge to add more native plants to this man, who's Doug Tallamy. So you may have read one of his incredibly popular books, Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, which he co-authored with Rick Dark, a really great resource that for the gardener brings in Doug's background, which is about the insects and how they benefit from the plants. And then Rick Dark, who's a wonderful designer. So really very practical ways that we can incorporate some great plants into our landscapes. And so Doug has, as I said, really helped a lot of us get excited and focused about native plants. And he just has a certain charisma that gets people wanting to make some changes. So I wanted to bring your attention to this webinar series in case you haven't signed up. This is our Tending Nature webinar series. We had Mary Gardner kicked us off in our first week, and then Doug Tallamy, Lisa Olson last week. Every Friday we're meeting. We still have room if you'd like to register, and the link is up there. We have Brian Danforth this week, who is going to focus on specialist bees. And tonight I'll give you a little preview of some of our specialist bees and why they're important. And then we're finishing up with Heather Holm, a wonderful author and educator, and then Deborah Kanapke, who many of you know. Deb, she's a garden designer and educator, teaches about a lot of different plant materials out of the Columbus, Ohio area. So why do we focus on natives? What's this interest? Why are we thinking about natives? And so for me, the love of native comes to kind of a love of place. These are all wildflowers from the Arc of Appalachia down in South Central Ohio. And every year, except for pandemic times, they have a wildflower pilgrimage where like-minded plant-loving people come together. They're really just amazing, wonderful people who come together. The Arc of Appalachia has these amazing natural places that people can go on lead walks and learn these amazing wildflowers. So they're places that we identify. We have a relationship with those places. Maybe it's the first place we learned about wild geraniums, or the little nook of woods close to where we grew up. So they're often meaningful to us from some reason from our past. If I asked you about the first plant you remember having a relationship with, and that's one thing about gardeners and naturalists, we do have relationships with plants. Plants are more than just photosynthesizing things out there. We have stories, we have emotions around plants. I can think of the first tree that I climbed as a little girl and how I really think of that red maple. I know it now, and I go back and can see that tree. So oftentimes we have stories around these plants, and not always native plants, but often these are our native plants that fill our memory and our emotions. Native plants also have these rich natural relationships that have evolved over eons. So the plants, the herbivores, the wildlife, the birds, all the organisms out there that depend on those native plants. And we're going to tease apart some of those natural relationships tonight. But a few caveats to native plants: are they better suited to our landscapes? And I hear this a lot. And we should be choosing native plants because they're native to this region and they perform better in the landscape than non-native plants. And if you're like me, your landscape, your home, or maybe the garden outside your office looked like this. The original topsoil was removed, the trees that were there were removed, and the soil was compacted, and now you have a house that is on land, but it's not really a native environment. So if you're choosing plants for this location and you're looking at the woods around you or at the park around you and thinking, well, those plants are doing well, they're from my region, they should do well in my yard, this is not really a native setting, right? This is not the conditions that plants evolved with. So my philosophy is that native plants are not necessarily better suited to our landscapes. It always comes back to right plant, right place. So if you have a very wet soil, if you have kind of a semi-wetland area, you're going to choose plants that fit that site, and not just choose a native plant because it's native to your region. It may not be suitable at all to your site. And sometimes non-native plants are more suited than the plants you happen to see close by in native spaces. Are they more resistant to pests? I would argue with you here as well. Just about every plant has pest problems, and many of our native plants are just as susceptible or more so to some of our pest problems. Often that's because pests have been introduced to our region. So think of the emerald ash borer, Dutch elm disease, or gypsy moth. Those are pests that did not evolve with native plants, and so native plants really don't have natural resistance to those pests. So a plant isn't necessarily able to resist a pest just because it's native. It depends very much on the suite of pathogens and insects that are attacking that plant. As I said, my background is really around plants and pollinators. And so I've been, for the last 10 years or so, really focusing on creating that pollinator habitat with a real focus on bees. How can we plant the kinds of nectar and pollen sources that bees really need? And one way we do that is we have a grant from the USDA, which is an integrated pest management grant with a focus on pollinator health. So did you hear that, right? This is a United States Department of Agriculture grant focused on integrated pest management, realizing how important pollinator health is. And so here in Ohio, the way we've used those pollinator health funds is to rear native plants. We have a wonderful colleague of mine who's in one of our research stations. He's an amazing propagator, grows out lots of native perennials for us. And then we're able to partner with many of those who are here tonight across Ohio with folks who have education or demonstration sites in Ohio in public spaces where people can learn about pollinators. So we help folks come and they pick up those plants and plant those out in demonstration gardens to teach people about pollinators. What do these plants look like? What do the pollinators look like? What's their life cycles? And how can we do more of this at home? How can I learn about some of these plants and want to do this back in my own landscape? So our primary focus has been on creating this pollinator habitat. And in the last couple of years, I really wanted to kind of widen that perspective. And because we're getting, people are excited about pollinators. They want to plant, they want to include the plants in the habitat that pollinators need. But how can we help people embrace this idea of biodiversity, which is really biological diversity, right? It's all the life that's out there. And how can we enhance and bring in and keep healthy that biodiversity that's out there? We're really facing a crisis of biodiversity. And so one of the things we do in these educational gardens is create signs. Imagine a plastic real estate type sign. This, I know it's hard to see because of the way the screen is, but if you imagine a sign that's taller than it is wide, and it has this chart on it, this diagram. And so on the left, we have 10 of the most attractive perennial plants for pollinators and others. And on the right, we have the creatures that depend on those networks. And then we have the lines that draw them together. So rather than just have a plant, a goldenrod, and we say this is a great pollinator plant, we say, here's an ironweed. It's great for pollinators, but it's also great for lots of other creatures, right? It's great for, it's a great nectar source for moths and butterflies. It's also a host plant for the American painted lady butterfly. That means the caterpillars need those leaves to develop. It's great for bumblebees. It has a specialist bee that needs it. We'll talk about that in just a minute. There are lots of other wild bees that come to this plant. There are other insects as well, wasps and beetles that come and feed. That nectar is a great flight fuel for lots of insects. So lots of insects will come to ironweed. And then it's also a source of nesting material and possibly seeds for songbirds. So all these different networks coming together around this one plant. So this is the specialist bee that I mentioned. A lot of our specialist bees, if you come to Friday's session with Brian Danforth, you'll learn that they don't have common names. They're not that common. They're not that commonly seen. It's not that they're all threatened, but we just don't have good common names. So this is the Melosodes denticulata is the scientific name. It's a longhorn bee. That's a good way to think of it. So it's the ironweed longhorn bee. And just like in the butterfly world, we know that monarchs need milkweed leaves, right? The monarch mom is going to lay her eggs on that milkweed plant. The eggs are going to hatch out and those caterpillars are going to eat the milkweed leaves. So it's very similar for specialist bees. They're young, they're the bee just even one plant can make a difference. What happens if that specialist bee doesn't get ironweed pollen? Well, she can't rear her young. If we took her and put her in a laboratory setting, if we took the egg and replaced that ironweed pollen with some other kind of pollen, let's say squash pollen or goldenrod pollen, perhaps that baby bee would develop. It would possibly emerge as an adult, but when it did, it would automatically go back. It's hardwired to go back to ironweed. The female only visits ironweed for pollen. Okay, and so pollen is that protein source for developing bee larvae, and nectar is the carbohydrate source. So there are lots of different insects that are going to come and visit plants for nectar. So I said one plant could be enough, and it can even be a cultivar. So this is the iron butterfly cultivar of ironweed. It's a much smaller ironweed. If you grow, I have an ironweed and outside my my back door, that's about 7 feet tall. Not exactly garden friendly. You know, it's a big plant. I love it because I love to see this bee come. But this iron butterfly cultivar is much smaller, maybe knee height, a little higher, kind of a tabletop sort of form, lots of individual flowers. And this specialist bee loves it. So you're still going to give the specialist bee what it needs with this iron butterfly. So I'm not opposed to cultivars. We'll talk about them a little bit more at the end. But certainly some cultivars can provide just what the pollinators need. And the challenge is there are so many different cultivars out there that we just can't test them all. But the bees will tell you, right? You put it in and watch them, and you'll see the bees on it or you won't. Okay, so we're talking about these networks, that we have these plants. They're part of a huge food web. They're not just a plant and a pollinator. They're really offering a lot of resources to many different creatures. So another example, this is probably our one of the best nectar plants out there. So this is a milkweed, this is butterfly weed. The milkweeds are really one of the best nectar sources. So if you only plant one one native perennial, you really need to plant a milkweed. And it could be butterfly weed, it could be swamp milkweed. They're a little smaller. There are actually lots of different milkweeds out there. Maybe somebody can add in the chat box. There's a really great publication here in Ohio that looks at all of our different milkweeds and shows images of them. So that you have a lot to choose from, but you don't have to get fancy. You can choose this Asclepias tuberosa, so butterfly weed with the orange flower. So very accessible nectar source on this plant. And we know that monarch butterflies have to find milkweed. This isn't really one of their favorite plants to lay eggs on, but you will find caterpillars on the butterfly weed. But lots and lots of nectar. Interestingly, insects can't gather the pollen from milkweeds. It's actually in little packets that stick onto the insect, but they actually can't process and eat that pollen. They just transport it for the plant. So a really great nectar source, but also rich for lots of other creatures. So look where all these lines are going. Of course, we know the host plant for the monarch, but there are other butterflies and moths that will come to milkweed as a host plant. So the caterpillars need those leaves.
Real quick,
it's a
Denise,
great nectar plant. Yes.
Is that chart available online somewhere?
I can get you the PDF of it. It's, as I said, it's we have signs that were made for it, and I'm happy to share that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So great nectar plant, great for bumblebees. You will see a lot of bumblebees and other bees on butterfly weed, especially when it's in full bloom. And if you have a mass of this plant, you're going to see wasps and beetles and flies there drinking in the nectar. And then it also can provide seeds and nesting habitat for birds and even for bees. So this is a non-native bee. This is the wool carder bee. We have several non-native bees. So this is an introduced bee, but one that you've probably seen in your landscape. You may have even confused it for a wasp because it does have this yellow and black coloration, not as hairy as some of our other bees, but it's definitely a bee. The female, it's a tunnel nesting bee, so it doesn't, it's a solitary bee, so they're just moms and dads, and the female provisions tunnels. Imagine a tube or tunnel, a drain hole from your metal patio furniture or your bamboo wind chime. So she needs a tunnel, and typically she'll gather leaf fluff, so leaf hairs from, say, your lamb's ear. So lamb's ear that has a little bald patch on it could be a sign that this wool carder bee has been there. She has strong teeth on her jaws, and she just pairs off those hairs, wads it up into a ball, and takes it back to that little tunnel. That's the crib mattress. And then she gathers pollen and nectar. She lays an egg in there, gathers more fluff, tucks it in there, and that's one little nursery cell. Okay. And so for many of these bees, I said we have 450 different species of bee in Ohio. We don't know enough about all of these bees. We don't have enough Randy Mitchells, who you're going to hear next week, an amazing bee biologist who's focusing on bumblebees. We don't have enough Randy Mitchells out there, Randy students, to study all these different bees. And so I was surprised to find one year I was out here in a friend's pollinator garden, and the milkweed had gone to seed. And here's this wool carder bee. Can you see it here? She's gathering the fluff from milkweed seeds, and that's what she's taking back then to provision her cells. So lots of different resources on just one plant, not just a nectar plant, not just for pollinators, but really rich for an assortment of creatures. So if we compare, and this is an unfair comparison, I admit, but if we compare that butterfly weed to Japanese anemone, and I grow Japanese anemone, I love it. I think it's a beautiful flower, especially later in the summer, adds a nice freshness to the garden, a nice tall presence there. But what networks does it enforce? Well, it's nice for bumblebees. I do see a lot of bumblebees on my Japanese anemone. Anemones happen to not offer nectar as a reward. Some plants offer pollen and nectar, some just pollen. Some plants even offer just nectar. So think of a fern. A nectary is a pore, if you will, on a plant that oozes nectar. And so even plants that don't have flowers can have nectaries, that we call them extra floral nectaries, or away from the flower nectaries. So even some plants that don't have flowers, like ferns, can offer nectar as a reward. So anyway, anemones don't offer nectar. Their reward is pollen, and lots of bumblebees will come to Japanese anemone. A few other bees you may see there, but definitely nothing like the network that we see with one milkweed plant. Okay, so I'm not saying don't plant Japanese anemone. I'm just saying realize that when you're using non-native plants, you're probably not supporting a lot of different creatures there in your landscape. Okay, so last time in this webinar series, Judy Semrock, who I just love, Judy and I go way back. She was the nature, we were leads of a nature club at a school that my kids went to. She was a science teacher there, so that was many years ago. Both our kids are grown. But she talked a lot about birds and about caterpillars and all the resources that some of our native trees and shrubs and vines provide. And so, I think there have been some silver linings with the pandemic. One of them is the interest that some folks have taken to birds. They have found that they love to watch the birds, to feed the birds, particularly at a time when we couldn't explore much. We felt, kind of restricted indoors. Just to see those birds really gave us a feeling of peace. And so the interest turned to, how do I get more birds to come to my landscape? What should I plant? What feeders can I add? How can I make my landscape more amenable to birds? And so, of course, we can put feeders outside, but we can also plant a landscape and invite birds in. And that can be through fruits, through plants that offer fruit that birds love, or through seed. But also it can be by adding plants that are good for caterpillars and other insects. Birds come then and feed on those insects, either feed as adults or take them back to feed the young. For hummingbirds, we know that spiders and other small insects are what the baby hummingbirds feed on. So the female or the adults are gathering those insects and taking them back to feed the young. We often think of hummingbirds as just needing nectar, but of course they need that protein source as well. And so Judy shared the importance of oaks, and Doug Tallamy has a great book just about oaks. It's really one of my favorite. It's actually my childhood tree. I grew up in the Laurel Highlands in Western Pennsylvania under the shade of the oaks, and white oaks just have a place in my heart. And so oaks are, they're wind pollinated, right? They have these catkins. They're not showy flowers. They're not fragrant. They don't invite the pollinators because of how they look or how they smell. But they still can be important pollen sources, and beekeepers know that. They often see honeybees coming back to the hive when oaks are in bloom, bringing back that oak pollen. So we kind of have two things going on here, right? We have pollination services that bees can provide, taking pollen from flower to flower on an apple, for example. So visiting an apple flower, getting some pollen on the bee's body, and then visiting another apple flower to provide that courier service. The wind is providing that pollination service when we talk about ash or oak or walnut, some of our wind pollinated plants. But that doesn't mean that bees don't visit those plants. They still can visit those wind pollinated plants. Those can be a good source of pollen. We just don't think of those flowers as being something that bees will visit. And also, if we think about trees, those flowers are so far up in the canopy that we're not really aware of all those insects that are visiting the flowers to gather pollen. And Doug Tallamy talks about the oaks as being, the best plant for all those caterpillar species, the butterflies and moths. People are always amazed when Doug does a program because he actually went out and he goes out and identifies all those caterpillars in. So these numbers are really from his eyes on the trees, finding all those tiny caterpillars and identifying them to species. And he talks about doing this, comparing an oak in his landscape to a Callery pear in a neighbor's landscape, where he could identify there was only one caterpillar species that was visiting that Callery pear. This is a walk close to me, a bike path that goes down to the Tuscarawas River that unfortunately has really been taken over by Callery pears. And it's just not offering much at all for many creatures at all. For pollinators, there are a few small bees that will visit, not many other wild bees will visit. Honeybees really want nothing to do with Callery pears, unfortunately. Birds will come and eat the fruit, but then they've moved the seed along, and that's one of the reasons that this has been such an invasive problem. So it's not plant an oak or plant a Callery pear. They're not interchangeable species. Your oak is going to need more space depending on the species. Your Callery pear tends to be a little more of an accent tree. But the idea is, if you can choose, and we can, what to put in the ground, why not choose a plant that's better for pollinators, that's more favored by moth and butterfly caterpillars, that favors then the food that birds need. And so this is a table from Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy, where he's talking about these keystone species, those most important species: oak, willow, cherry, plum, and crabapple. I've highlighted because not only are they great for caterpillars, so for bird food, but they're also really wonderful for pollinators. So you're doing double duty when you're planting one of these trees in those groups, because they're feeding so many creatures. Let's contrast that with a ginkgo. And I love cool plants as much as anyone. Ginkgo, an ancient plant that millions of years ago was native to this area. I guess it depends what your definition of native is. But ginkgos really have, if we put this on the chart that had all those lines, there's really nobody going to a ginkgo. There's people will gather the seed. It is a delicacy. Apparently you can roast the seed. I've never had them. But there really aren't insect species associated with the ginkgo tree. From a horticultural perspective, this may mean that horticulturists say this is a great tree to plant because it's pest-free. It probably doesn't have many pest problems, although things can always be introduced in the future that we can't see at this point. But to me, a ginkgo is like a statue in the landscape. It is providing biological services, right? It's photosynthesizing, it's helping to filter water, it's improving soils. But as far as being food for other creatures, there's not much happening there. Okay, so again, I'm not saying you shouldn't plant a ginkgo, but think about how much space do you have and what kind of legacy do you want to leave? And I'm hoping that maybe an oak or some other monumental kind of tree that's providing more ecological services is something that becomes your legacy. So what are some approaches to including these native plants? And this is from the really beautiful butterfly garden at Holden Arboretum in Northeast Ohio. If you haven't been to Holden, it's so worth a visit in summer to see this butterfly garden. mowed pathways through it. They could call it a bee garden because there's so many bees there, but the bees and the butterflies are happily foraging together, gathering what they need from those flowers. So we can add a sprinkle of flowers here and there. So this could be a pot of purple coneflower on the deck, or a few plants in your community garden site, or a few plants in your yard. Doesn't have to be a whole dedicated garden. Even a few plants, just as we saw with that ironweed, 1 or 2 plants can make a big difference. So a few plants here and there is great. And purple coneflower is an excellent one to add if you have 5 hours or so of sunlight. You're going to get nice bloom from this plant, and the bees and the butterflies are going to find those flowers. So it could be just a couple plants. Maybe you can incorporate natives into your existing bed. So here's a shade garden, and this gardener has added some Itea here, and also added some native fern, along with some hostas and some other non-native plants. So it doesn't have to be a natives only garden. They can be incorporated into what you already have. Maybe you want a more dedicated space for those natives. This is a pollinator garden at Penn State in Happy Valley, where they have a plethora of native perennials blooming all throughout the summer. Here we have some milkweeds, and we have the purple coneflower, we have joe pye, lots of different perennials there, monarda blooming in succession through the summer. But maybe you have a little more space and you can put in a meadow, or maybe you have a right-of-way area. This is a meadow at Dawes Arboretum in Ohio, outside of Newark, Ohio. They have a lot of different meadow areas there at Dawes. They also have several rights-of-way that go through the Dawes campus, if you will, and they worked with utility companies to really investigate and study which native perennials do best in that right-of-way situation, and then they study which pollinators come to visit those plants. But even a little meadow is worth a try. This is a small prairie planting that we have at Sechrist Arboretum in Worcester in Central Ohio, and maybe 60 by 60 or so. It's kind of a kidney shape. We mow it around the edges, so it looks like it's here on purpose. That's really a nice element that helps your neighbors recognize what you're doing, that you're not just kind of, they might think you're out there anyway, but there's a purpose to this garden. They can tell that you want it there because you've mown a nice edge to it. And then we also have some signage that identifies the plants and also talks about pollinators and birds that come to that meadow. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of those elements that, some of those ideas that we want to add into our planting, no matter what, big or small. And I want to take you back to one of my pandemic passions. So we've all found something that keeps us going. And for me, it's been cycling. Done a lot of bicycle riding. I have the Tuscarawas River has a canal pathway side done. So I brightest sense of it, and I thought of my friend Dan Herms, and went a little further from there. I'm like, it doesn't have to be Dan's name, an idea for every letter. How about Denise? So this is different color, but diversity is just the number of different species that we have out there. So we want to have a lot of diversity in our plantings. The A is for abundance. So abundance is the number of flowers that are in bloom. So a lawn area that has dandelions and white clover, it can have abundance of bloom, right? And that can be, there's really a lot of bloom activity happening, even if there are only 2 floral species. So it may not have a lot of diversity, but it can have a lot of flower abundance. The N is for natives, so trying to add those natives in as often as we can, increasing the percentage of our natives. One of the talks earlier today, the designer was talking about percentages of plants in each of her, the gardens that she's worked with. Well, this one has 70% natives and this one is 80% natives. You know, even if you're at 20% natives and you put another native in, that's great. You know, we're kind of moving in the right direction. So can we think about incorporating more natives into our landscapes? And incidentally, this is from a really nice guide to planting across the season that Cornell University put out. I have a reference list that I'll share with you that that lists this. But look, you know, beautiful pictures of these great native plants and the bees that visit them. So the N is natives. The I in Denise is introduced plants. I'm okay with having some introduced plants in your landscape. I don't think that most of us are going to be really sticklers and say, I'm only going to plant native plants. I love pesto. I spent my junior year in Italy. I have to have fresh pesto. I'm going to grow basil. I'm going to grow oregano. I'm going to grow tomatoes and peppers and other plants that are not native to where I am in my corner of the world. So I'm okay with including introduced plants. You can choose for your own garden. I think that's great. But I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to include invasive plants. Weeds are okay. If you've heard me teach before, you know that white clover, red clover, some of our more weedy asters, dandelions, there are an assortment of weeds that are really great for pollinators. So choosing which weeds you allow to grow and which ones you don't. No calorie pears get into my little meadow area, although they try. Multiflora rose, I'm pulling out those seedlings as often as I see them. Bittersweet, anytime a bird brings a seed and I notice that sprout, I'm pulling that out. So invasives, no, but I'm okay with some introduced plants. You can decide there. And then the S is for seasonality. And so to me, that means trying to have bloom across the season as much as we can. So starting with something like maples, blooming very late winter, early spring here in Ohio, and trying to span that season all the way through. Now we're into October or November with our asters and our goldenrods. So in the bee world, we have lots of different bees that are active throughout the season. Some, if you're a beekeeper, you know your bees are flying when it's about 55 and sunny from late winter all the way through into early winter. So most of the season, as long as it's warm enough and sunny, those bees are active. Other bees like bumblebees, they have a fairly long span of time that they're foraging. Other bees are pretty specific. That ironweed specialist bee, it's only going to be out those 6 weeks or so that ironweed is in bloom. So trying to span the season, whether it's generalist pollinators that are going to go to lots of different plants or a specific specialist who needs just a few plants. And here's our mason bee that's out very early in the season, the queen bumblebees as well. So having those early season plants, really important for those early season pollinators like queen bumblebees. So diversity, abundance, natives, introduced plants, and seasonality. Some key ideas when you're looking at your landscape, trying to decide which plants to include and how to group those together. So it's not just a meadow. Trees, shrubs, and forbs, the flowering plants, are all important. Trees have a lot of qualities that pollinators need here in Ohio in late winter, early spring through really late spring. It's the trees that are doing the lion's share of the work for pollinators. They're blooming, they're producing pollen and nectar. We do have some ephemeral wildflowers, but if you think of the millions of flowers that are in a couple maple trees or willow trees compared to, you know, a small patch of trillium or other ephemerals, those are great plants, but the trees are really the flag, they're the beacon, they're bringing the insects in. And so thinking about creating layers where we have some lawn areas, hopefully including some of those lawn flowers or weeds in with our turf grass, some annual areas, some perennial herbaceous plantings, some shrubs, and then the tree canopy. So we have all these layers, not just the plants and the pollen and nectar, but also some nesting habitat built in there. Let's talk about a few of my favorite plants. Some of these Judy mentioned in her talk as well, so I'll kind of speed by a few of them, but want to pull out some attributes of others. And I did want to mention the National Wildlife Foundation Native Plant Finder. I did, if you go way back in the chat, I put this link in here for you. It's a customized, it's actually in the beta stage, but it is, you can go there, you put in your zip code anywhere in the country, and you can get a list of native plants that are kind of tailored down for that portion of even your state. And I've done this in Ohio, where I've compared my zip code here. I put the zip code, one of the zip codes in Cincinnati in, and it brings me different plants. It brings me a list of different butterflies or moth species for those regions. So it is a customizable tool, and they've worked with Doug Tallamy to pull Doug's research into this native plant finder. The other link that I put in, also from the National Wildlife Federation, and that's why I put the link in for you instead of having you have to deal with writing that one down. So it is in the chat box. It's also on the resource page that I'm going to share with you. But this one lets you seek by ecoregion. So I noticed there were some people here from out of state, from Minnesota, from New Orleans. You can choose your region of the country. I happen to pull up the Eastern Temperate Forest region for us in Ohio. And this is just a part of what pulls up, but it gives you, this is that keystone species list that I pulled out. You know, here's our oak and our cherries, our birch, poplar, maple, etc. And then there's also a list of top host plants for pollen specialist bees. So here we have sunflowers, goldenrods, asters, gumweed, black-eyed Susan, and how many specialist bees are associated with this plants. There's also a list of best plants for the lepidopterans, the butterflies and moths as well. So a wonderful tool. I think they just kind of launched this. I didn't know about this last season, but I've used this a lot so far this year. And so what I've done from that native plant finder, like Judy did last time, and here's that link again, put in my zip code, and I wanted to find out about maples, and they tell you 273 species of butterflies and moths use this as a caterpillar host plant in my area, so it's customized. And then they tell me about the top 15, and I just pulled a few of those here for you. So you can see morning cloak butterfly needs maple as the host plant, the caterpillar food source. But then we've also got a lot of birds that depend on maples. Here, the yellow-bellied sapsucker, they'll drill the holes in maples, the sap comes out, and then guess who comes in? The hummingbirds. They come to those sap wells, they keep visiting, they're gathering the sugars and also any insects that happen to be attracted to that sap. So a neat association happening there. This is also a great plant for early queen bumblebees. Queens are out early in the season and they need to refuel. They spent all winter underneath your compost pile or in the corner of your windrow, trying to stay warm and alive, tucked down about 12 inches deep. They have fat bodies, but they've burnt through most of that fat by the time spring comes along. And so they have to refuel. They're looking for those early season flowers like maples and willows. And so willows, we have male and female separate flowers on different plants. Both male and female are offering good resources to pollinators. They have nectar and very desirable pollen. Willows have 11 specialist bees that are going to visit those flowers. So here's a little Andrena mining bee. That's a specialist. This bee can only visit willow to gather that pollen for the young. And then we have different butterfly species, the morning cloak and others that 456 others exactly that that need that willow, the leaf tissue for the young. Serviceberry, one of my very favorite trees. If you're trying to find something to plant instead of calorie pear, well, soon it's going to be illegal to plant more calorie pears, but the birds are doing lots of plantings of those invasive pears. But serviceberry, a wonderful native tree, a beautiful white flower early in spring. It's in the rose family, so it's a very simple floral arrangement, 5 petals, very open for its offering of pollen and nectar. So lots of bees will come, and as they're pollinating these flowers, then later you're going to get the fruit, which is has a blueberry-like flavor and are really desired by birds. I love to pick them and eat them. This is a plant actually here that's over my back deck. And if I can beat the birds to them, I get to pick them every day, a pint or so. And I leave lots for the birds as well. So, so serviceberry, sometimes used as a street tree, so it can be fairly adaptable. Redbud, more of a shade-loving or edge plant, a nice native tree with this kind of pink purplish bloom color. This is a native bee that loves this, this flower. This Calides bee is a solitary ground nesting bee. The polyester bee is called that because the female can secrete a substance that's like polyester or cellophane from her abdomen, and she goes down in this tunnel and creates a little waterproof bubble with that polyester substance. Inside that bubble, she's gathered kind of a soupy mix of nectar and pollen, and then from the top of that bubble, she suspends an egg. These are often in very sandy soils, as you can see here from this little mound. But even if the soil floods, that little bee is protected in that little polyester bubble, and the egg protected there on the top until it hatches and then drops down and feeds on that pollen and nectar. So a bee that has just 1 generation per year, so it won't be until next year when redbuds are in bloom that you would have the chance to see this, this female adult bee again. Cherries, one of the best native trees that you can grow. We have a number of different species, choke cherries, pin cherries, particularly in Northeast Ohio. We have, it's one of our earliest blooming trees is the pin cherry. Also black cherries, great for birds, great for butterflies. So if you have room enough, you know, the native cherries sometimes are a little large, not always strong in their wood and their form. And so we may not want them right close to the house, but if you have enough space to have a, you know, black cherry out further in the landscape or in a space where it's not going to be a nuisance, as far as losing limbs or other disease problems, really great trees for wildlife. And again, this is from the Native Plant Finder that tells us there are 381 species of butterflies and moss, and just a sampling of a few of those species here. I love shrub dogwoods. I think that tree dogwoods are a little more problematic to site in the landscape, that our Cornus florida or flowering dogwood really needs that kind of sheltered site, doesn't like hot suns, doesn't like poor hot soils. And so where does the developer put them? Right in front of the house, right? In the sunniest, hottest spot, and those trees often suffer. But shrub dogwoods, very suitable for our landscapes. We can plant them in mass, where they offer good cover for birds. The flower clusters, not as showy as something like the flowering dogwood, but very rich source of pollen and nectar, and a good source of food for many caterpillars. One of my very favorite shrubs, you're not going to want to plant it this spring, because when you go to the garden center, it's not going to be very interesting. The flowers are small, although pollinators do visit them. Lots of bees will visit the flowers on winterberry, but it's really in the late summer into fall and winter that this plant is at its best. So full of beautiful fruit. It does have male and female, separate male and female plants. And so you need 1 male for about a dozen or so, maybe up to 2 dozen females. The bees are doing that job of moving the pollen from the male plant to the female. And then you're getting all this berry production, especially if it's in a good sunny spot. So they can take a little more moisture, but they do need more sun if you want the good flowers and good fruit set. We have 39 species of butterflies and moths, and 1 specialist bee that will come to this winterberry holly. But my favorite part about this plant is when the birds come in to feed on that fruit. This year it happened for me. It usually happens more in January or February. But this year it was just after the Christmas holiday, and I had so many robins come. And within 2 or 3 days, that plant was just stripped bare. There's usually more of a freeze thaw with that fruit before and the bluebirds are often who comes and shares those fruit with the robins. But this year it was all robins. Judy talks about buttonbush, which is a shrub a native shrub to Ohio that usually likes a wet site, but it is very adaptable. It can be a good landscape plant. And last year I was on my way to Toledo for a program. I stopped at an interstate rest stop, a turnpike rest stop, and they actually had cephalanthus or buttonbush. They're in a little pollinator garden right in front of the rest stop. So, it's not getting TLC. The garden looked fine, but they don't have a gardener who's there taking care of that plant, which just tells you this is a pretty tough plant if it can survive in that kind of exposed and not babied location. So one of the neat things about buttonbush is that the flowers are fairly shallow. And so these shallow flowers, when we talk about flower diversity, we need to have flowers that are deep, full of nectar for something like a butterfly or a hummingbird, but also flowers that are shallow. So something like a small wasp or a very small bee that doesn't have a long tongue can access that nectar and gather that pollen. And so some of our beneficial insects are going to be able to gather nectar or pollen from a flower that's shallow, like that cephalanthus or like this dandelion. And so many of those flies, like this flower fly, they're bee mimics. They look like bees. They need pollen or nectar. They need nectar for the flight fuel, that carbohydrate source. They often need pollen to mature their ovaries or their eggs. And then once they're mated, this female is going to go find aphids in your landscape, and she's going to lay her eggs where the larvae, then the maggots, these are beneficial maggots, and they're going to eat those aphids and hopefully mature, pupate, mature as adults, mate again. And as long as you have some of those nice shallow flowers, so think of flowers in the carrot family, your parsley when it comes back, if it goes to bloom, or Queen Anne's lace, dill, as I said, cephalanthus, or some of those daisy flowers, those disc flowers in the middle of your daisy, very shallow. So often those beneficial insects can access that pollen and nectar. So when you're thinking about flower diversity, think of that shape and the depth of the flower. Here's Golden Alexander. It is in the carrot family, very shallow flowers. And these are images from Heather Holmes. She's an amazing photographer. If you pick up some of her books, they're virtually all her photographs. She's out there all the time with bees. And here she's captured images of the specialist bee that has to have Zizia pollen, Golden Alexander pollen. Foxglove beardtub, another really great plant to include, a native, really deep flower. You'll often see bumblebees reaching down far in here for the nectar. If we look back at that network, lots of different the nectar source for hummingbirds, also visited by bumblebees, a specialist bee, and lots of other insects, kind of earlier in the season. So one of our first perennials in the landscape to offer a resource. Bee balm and wild bergamot, the monardas, are just amazing. Hummingbirds like them. If you haven't visited the website for the Mount Cuba Center, they do a lot of research on natives, and they study many of the cultivars, evaluating them for disease resistance, for suitability in the landscape, for do the bees visit, do the butterflies and hummingbirds visit. And so we actually chose a Jacob Klein monarda, the bee balm, for our demonstration gardens a few years ago because of that research from Mount Cuba. We wanted to have a plant that we knew the bees were going to love. Bumblebees love bee balm, but we wanted something that the hummingbirds would prefer as well. Just to finish up, a couple other plants that are great for specialist bees. Here's the goldenrod. Don't think of goldenrod as this tall invasive plant that you can't get rid of. There really are a lot of different species and some garden-worthy cultivars that you could include. So don't think that everything is going to be 6 feet tall and is going to spread underground, but great for moths and butterflies, great for specialist bees, like this little Andrena mining bee. The Andrenas are usually early spring bees, but this is a Andrena that has a specific relationship with goldenrod. It's a late season mining bee, and the mom has to visit goldenrod to gather all that yellow pollen for her offspring. Hairy waist is the Latin name, and you can see all these great rows of hair on this cute mining bee. Andrena also has specialist bees. Aster also has specialist bees associated with it. So this Andrena or mining bee, a different species, has to have aster. And again, from the Mount Cuba Center, they've done some great research on asters to help you select an aster that'll be the best for your situation. What about cultivars and hybrids? So I already mentioned there has been some research to kind of look at some of the different cultivars. From my perspective, we don't have enough people to evaluate. It's great that Mount Cuba is doing this research because there aren't enough people out there to really evaluate all the different cultivars and hybrids that we have to determine. Some are better for pollinators, some are not, and some are neutral. And so we don't have any blanket statements that we can make, such as you should not plant cultivars or hybrids. It really does depend. Except when it comes to tinted or hued color leaves. So this is work out of Doug Tallamy's lab, where a student evaluated some different cultivars of shrub that had colorful leaves like this 9-bark, and found that those hues are plant secondary metabolites. They're compounds that keep herbivores from eating the leaves. And so if you want to pick a shrub that's going to have more caterpillars, you're probably not going to want to pick one of these cultivars that has chemicals in the leaf. It's not going to kill the caterpillars, but they're not going to find it as attractive. They're not going to fare as well on that plant. So if you are looking to choose a cultivar, maybe don't choose one that has colorful leaves or deep colored leaves, because the the caterpillars may not eat them as well. And something that I recommend is go ahead and plant the straight species too. You just have to have this cultivar. I'm not sure why, but also put in the straight species. So the true species that can come true from seed, because we know that has what the pollinators have evolved with. It has the pollen quality and quantity that bees have come to know. So there was a lot of ideas there, a lot of different plants. What I would encourage you to do is just do one thing. Maybe it's including that legacy tree in your landscape. Think about that oak that you're actually planting for your great grandchild. Adding one plant in, maybe it's a mountain mint. I love mountain mint. It doesn't grow underground like your peppermint and spearmint. This is a native clump forming mint. It has a great mint smell to the leaves. But it has all these tiny little flowers that produce lots and lots of nectar. You're going to get little skippers and all kinds of bees. They're going to visit your mountain mint. And when that clump gets bigger, you can just pull some of the edges out and share those with your neighbors so they can see how cool it is to have all those pollinators visiting your plant. And you also have those nice, pretty flowers and that mint scent. So pick one area, add a few plants in, add a few more natives, and watch then who visits, which birds, which bees, which butterflies visit your yard. A couple resources to learn more. So I put together a quick link for you here. It's the go.osu.edu/natives. I know many people are looking for native plant nurseries. I have a couple maps on there. They're not mine, but I've brought them in from others who've put together resources where we can find native plants in Ohio. Those from out of state, I don't think this will help you too much unless you take a trip here. But we have a list of native plant nurseries. We have an Ohio native plant list that Deborah Kanapke and Hope Taft put together. So it's mostly garden type plants that are native to Ohio in an Excel file. So more plants than, I don't know, than you could ever buy. You buy a lot of plants, but more for your list. How's that? And then fact sheets and resources, like I mentioned, that Cornell guide and other great resources for native plants. Those native plant finder links are on there as well. So there's my contact information. I'm at blab.osu.edu, where you can find our recorded webinars and other resources. My email, ellsworth.2@osu.edu. If you email me, please send me pictures of flowers and bees. That makes it really fun to open my email rather than when I see paperwork I'm supposed to fill out. So thanks again. I hope you learned something tonight. I'm happy to answer some questions.
That's good because we have a few.
Okay.
So in your resources, I'm sure there are native plant resources for community gardens in the link that you provided.
I don't know that specifically for community gardens, but there are a lot of plants that will do well in community gardens. I mean, surely size is one of the limitations. So you don't want something that's going to be too big or too, fill in too much space. But actually, Deborah Kanapke is really interested in native herbs. So why not plant some herbs that, they're edible or useful for other reasons? Those would be nice additions to a community garden site.
And what about charts and displays available for prairies?
I'm not sure what you mean.
So like planting just a prairie, so not necessarily trees, but that more
Sure. So I do
land.
Yeah, so I do link to some resources on creating a larger expanses of habitat for pollinators. The Xerces Society has some really wonderful guides. Let's say you're an organic grower, you don't want to use pesticides to prepare the meadow for the seed bed. They have a guide that talks about how to do that. And then all the steps, how do you prepare the soil? How do you find the seed? What are all the follow-up steps? So again, a lot of resources on the B-Lab website.
Can you go back to that website page?
I sure can. Yep.
Thank
Now
you.
we can put it in the chat box as well. So it's a Go link. And here, I'll just put it in.
Perfect.
There you go. So it's a hot link in there. You can click on it, take a look at it.
Excellent. Are there, now you talked a lot about the variety of maples out there, but what about oaks? Are there some oaks better for bees than others? How would we find that information?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure that how much the oaks have been evaluated as far as bee visitation. There's a wonderful researcher from Cornell who, Cass Urban Mead, and she doesn't work with oaks. She works with other more showy canopy trees, but she actually has figured out a way to put bee bowls, which are bowls that will collect bees, up into the tree canopy. And then she identifies those bees, because otherwise we have no idea who's out there flying around. I mean, these are really small bees. Sometimes they're as small as a grain of rice. So even with good binoculars, there's just no way we can tell who's out there. So to my knowledge, I don't know that anyone has evaluated different oaks for pollinator visitation. Maybe someone knows about that and could put that in the chat box. But I think in general, oaks are such great resources. Finding an oak to suit your site is the most important piece. And then the birds and the caterpillars and the bees are going to find that tree.
And then another question, are crab apples native? And I think there are some that are. And then a follow-up to that is, do you know an effective way to treat cedar rust on the amelanchier and the crab apples and the hawthorn?
So there is a native malus. So malus is the genus of crab apples and apples. So there is a native, there are native maluses, but a lot of what we use in the landscape are not native apples. The crab apples are amazing for pollinators. Cornell has, I think I have it referenced, probably not that natives page, but I do have it on the B-Lab website. Cornell has a resource that shows, I think, 137 different species of bee that have been associated with crab apples and apples. So a really great pollen and nectar resource, but most of what we plant in the landscape are non-natives. And now we have, just like we have with Bradford calorie pears, we have a lot of non-native crabs that have become more invasive and are self-seeding. So it is definitely an issue. I mean, the plus is that they have more benefits for pollinators, but they're still invasive weed trees that are taking over native spaces. So you're going to have to look a little harder if you want to find a native apple for sale. But again, maybe in the chat box, somebody knows of a place to get that.
And Downy gentian, to create a splash of blue among the goldenrods. That's a native, right?
I don't grow gentian, so I couldn't tell you site-wise what's the best gentian to grow, but there are some really amazing gentians. I just realized I didn't answer the question about cedar apple rust, and I don't want to go off on that tangent too much. It's a fairly difficult disease to manage if you're not going to use fungicides, which I wouldn't, especially in a non-production system. So it's something that you could just tolerate. It usually doesn't kill the plant. Some people like the look of those sporangia, those teleal horns, the orange globs that come out of the juniper, the alternate host. But it should be something that is mostly cosmetic, and if not, then you may just want to take the plant out.
Yeah, and any juniper and red cedar that's nearby, just kind of move it further away, right?
And those spores are spread on the wind, so I don't. And if they're in the environment, they're coming from, if not yours, your neighbors. So chances are it's going to be there.
Do you have, let's say, top 5 shade-loving natives?
Oh, it's quiz time, is it?
Yes.
Well, I like Lindera is great for so spicebush is great for shade. We have Staphylea on the river path. It's great for bumblebees, has kind of like a little bell-shaped flower. Geraniums are nice for shade. Fothergilla is good for shade. I have one more and then I'm off the hook. One more for shade, trying to think of who I have outside. It's a little trickier with shade, so you do have to investigate a little deeper. Jewelweed, there we go. That's my 5. Great for bumblebees. Jewelweed is a really nice, a nice choice.
All right. Let's see. It's another good one. Oh, someone asked about dead ash trees, drilling holes in them for borer bees or nesting bees. Would that be a good idea? And how big and how deep would you drill holes?
So ash trees kind of shatter, as you probably know, when they're dead. Some trees will stand dead and they're fairly strong, but ash trees tend to lose their structural strength when they're dead. And so you'll get a lot of limb drop. And so I would say you don't really even need to drill holes that kind of safely. You want to make sure that tree falls in a place that is not going to harm you or going to harm structures. But a fallen log is a great resource for bees. There's a species or a group of bees that nest in that rotting wood. Bees are going to find the dead limbs. So I don't know that you need to necessarily go through the work of drilling those holes. You can, and usually we recommend maybe a couple different drill sizes, because different pollinators, different bees or wasps, solitary wasps, will choose different size holes based on what they like. So you could kind of give them an assortment, but there's lots on your to-do list anyway. So I'm not sure that I'm not saying you need to do that. I think that allowing the tree to drop, leaving a log in the landscape, or leaving firewood to rot is a really great way to create habitat.
Yes. The Tending Nature series, it's recorded, but do you have to be registered to see the recordings?
You don't. So I'll put I've lost my cursor, but maybe somebody could put that in the chat box. So it's a go.osu.edu/tending nature, all one strand, no spaces. So go.osu.edu/tending nature. And if you go to that webpage, all the recordings are posted there. You don't have to have registered to have access to those recordings.
All right, let's do, how many more you want to answer? I think you got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more.
I'm good for a little bit.
Okay,
Thanks,
sounds good.
everybody. I see some are putting thank yous and maybe have to hop off. I just want to thank everybody for coming. It was great to see lots of
Yes,
familiar names there.
absolutely. Yes. Thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you for the next speech. So red buds. Someone says that they noticed that this summer their red bud had white aphids all over. Should they be worried?
I'm not sure what, which insect, which aphid that might be, but in general, I don't worry about aphids because to me, aphids mean there are predator insects that are coming. They may already be there, but you haven't looked closely at those aphids. So a little cluster of aphids to me is good news. Maybe there'll be ladybird beetle adults that come, maybe lady beetle larvae that look like little alligators. There are lacewing larvae that will eat aphids. There are wasps that will come, a little tiny wasp that stings an aphid and lays her egg in the aphid. And then the aphid kind of blows up like a paper bag and dies, puffs up like a paper bag and dies. You'll have little aphid mummies, we call them. So to me, aphids are not a big deal. They're not doing a lot of damage. We don't have a lot of disease transmission by aphids in a non-commercial sense. So I would leave the aphids, get out the hand lens and see what natural enemies are out there.
Very good. Asparagus, is it beneficial to insects after harvest when the plant has gone to seed?
So when the plant has gone to seed, I'm not sure who would come. I don't know. This is a Marnie Tichenell question, our wonderful wildlife specialist, to see if there are birds that come and eat that fruit. But I will say that asparagus, when it's in bloom, so it has just little tiny dangling flowers. We don't usually even notice them, but a lot of little tiny bees will visit those asparagus flowers. And asparagus has very orange pollen. So you'll see very orange pollen in the pockets of those little tiny bees. So a nice thing to notice on your asparagus. So it's great because we get to enjoy the asparagus, but also those flowers are nice for bees.
Let's see, native and invasive herbs. Those would be like what's native, what's invasive. That would be included in the resources that you provided, right?
I'm not sure. I'll have to ask Deb Kanapke for a list of make a note here of native herbs. I'm not a big herb person besides culinary, so I'm not sure which ones she includes with native. She was going to do a program for me on that pre-pandemic, and we just never got it rescheduled. But so I'd like to make the distinction, though. We have native plants, we have non-native plants, and then we have invasive plants. So not all non-native plants are invasive. Not all weeds are invasives. So invasive plants, invasive weeds are those that have jumped the fence. Someone asked a question today about groundsel. Groundsel is a weed. It's a common weed, but it's not an invasive weed to my knowledge because it hasn't jumped the fence into native natural areas. And that's when a plant becomes invasive. So the bittersweet that, the birds drop in the fence row and it starts to move into the woods behind the lot, that's an invasive plant. So we talk as gardeners, sometimes we talk about that's a really invasive plant, like a mint. It's really invasive. That's really an aggressive plant. So invasive has a much more narrow definition. It's jumped the fence and it's invading into natural areas.
And someone else asked the question about if they had an invasive that they liked, could they keep it in a pot? And I know that there have been some invasives that have left the pot and now are taking over. So just be cautious with that.
Well, and I know Judy Semrock talked a lot about bittersweet, which people want to, it's beautiful that when it's in the fall and people want to incorporate that into wreaths, but it's you can't keep the seeds from dropping and you're going to get those sprouts coming up. It's really a bad idea. So yeah, so I don't, with invasives, I would just say skip it. I mean, there are better plants that you can put in your pot.
Queen Anne's lace isn't considered invasive right now, correct?
Well, it's been removed from the noxious weed list, which is kind of different than invasive. Those
Okay.
are plants that have environmental, agricultural, or human health issues associated with them. And they recently took Queen Anne's lace off that list. So just a quick story about Mary Gardner, who's one of our professors here in entomology. She did a really fascinating 5-year research project on vacant properties in Cleveland. And in some of those vacant lots planted little pocket prairies. And she found that, and then some they didn't plant, they just mowed or they let the weeds come up. And they actually found that Queen Anne's lace was one of the best plants that came up by itself, didn't take over everything, but provided very short carrot family, provided a lot of food resource for different little bees. So if you have to have nothing, she found clovers, the chicory, I think, was another one, and Queen Anne's lace, really, really great for pollinators. So don't forget about those waste spaces. They can often provide, especially in urban areas, some good habitat.
And since you're talking about bringing in a diversity of insects, are there any good IDing programs or texts or books, something that to identify what's coming in?
Okay, so a couple of my favorite books, I happen to have them right here. So for bees, you have to get The Bees in Your Backyard by Olivia Carroll and Joe Wilson. We've done a lot of webinars with Olivia, and we have them on our Bee Lab website. Everything's on YouTube too, but they're just amazing with bee identification. Pollinators of Native Plants by Heather Holm. Again, Heather is an amazing photographer, and she'll list plant by plant. So here I turn to downy yellow violet, and she'll list all the insects that are associated with those plants, different bees, how they work the flowers. Really, Heather Holm's books are amazing. And then the Xerces Society has a few titles as well. This is Attracting Native Pollinators from Xerces. It's a few years old, but still really great information. This is Farming with Native Beneficial Insects from Xerces. And so more of a focus on which plants can you put in for those natural enemies, beetles and flies and wasps that'll come help to manage some of the pest problems. So there's some favorites.
Some light reading. So is anyone working on any cultivars that are specifically designed to attract pollinators?
Well, yeah, I mean, so right. I mean, I think some of this, what a cultivar is a selection of a plant that has some benefit to people. It's a human drawn out selection. And so sometimes that's disease resistant, sometimes it's floral color, sometimes it's, attractiveness to butterflies or to bees. And so we can have a cultivar for any number of reasons. And then it's a matter of kind of evaluating between those cultivars, which one is really better for hummingbirds, which is better for butterflies or for monarchs or what have you. So it's kind of the layers of investigation that happens once those cultivars are developed, which is why it's so hard to know. Some people say, I don't, and you can do whatever you want in your garden. That's what's great about gardening, right? And you can say you don't want cultivars, and that's fine, but to condemn all cultivars as bad, it's a blanket statement that really doesn't have fact behind it, because there are so many cultivars. We don't have enough people and enough time and enough money to actually evaluate all those cultivars. Some are going to be great for pollinators, some maybe not so great. None of them are going to kill pollinators, right? So good, neutral, bad, but not that bad.
Yeah. Let's see. Bringing in pollinators, but controlling for pests like asparagus beetles without hurting the beneficial bugs. Any tips?
So you're always going to, as an extension educator, I always come at pest problems from an integrated pest management perspective. So knowing what the pest is, identifying that aphid and then investigating, is this a real pest or is it just incidentally there? Is it causing a lot of damage? And then if it is, what are all my strategies for managing that pest? So just because we use something that is an organic pesticide doesn't mean it's good for pollinators. There are labeled organic or certified organic insecticides that are very damaging to bees and other pollinators. It's knowing the product, it's making a good choice, it's reading the label. So just because something is organic doesn't mean it's not going to harm bees. Some organic products have a residual effect. So if you sprayed that asparagus and it's in bloom, when bees come later, that residue is going to affect the bees, and it may not kill them. Sometimes it affects bee behavior. It can make them forget the way home or forget which flower is best, and that harms bees as well. So there's a great, your extension office is a great place to go for more information. There's a National Pesticide Information Center, NPIC, and they actually have a 1-800 phone number, or you can email them or go on their website, and they'll give you science-based pesticide information. They'll help you read labels and choose products that are safest for bees. So I send people there all the time because they know the products, and I don't want to tell you the product's wrong. So
the list that you provide, I'm sure, have what natives can I plant in a totally shaded understory under maples and oaks?
So my best suggestion for a really shady situation, if it's a pretty it's a woodland-like situation, is to see what's growing in woodland areas near you. Jewelweed, which plants are growing, the spice bush, and maybe trying to mimic that, since your soils are probably similar. But as I said, the shade situation is a little trickier for pollinators because most bees need a lot of light. Honeybees need a lot of light. Bumblebees can actually forage in that woodland area. They don't need as much light. Many of our small bees, it's just going to be too dark in there to draw them in. Mm-hmm. So maybe your ephemeral wildflowers that are up before the tree canopy fills in, that's going to bring pollinators in because they're going to work those flowers before it's too dark in there.
Do you have any thoughts on dwarf oaks?
No, I don't know much about dwarf oaks. But again, kind of right plant, right place. If it's going to bloom, you're going to get that pollen benefit in those catkins, and then hopefully it's going to set acorns. But I don't know much about dwarf oaks.
And let's see.
Somebody mentioned, Vicki put a note in there that the Herb Society of America lists native herbs by state. So thank you, Vicki, for pointing that out. The Herb Society of America, because somebody was asking about native herbs.
Someone asked, what application did you create your presentation with?
Just PowerPoint. Yeah.
And let's see, 2 more. How can I tell if my crabapple is native or cultivated?
If it's growing in your landscape, it's not native. That's my guess. Yeah. I mean, most of our crabs are not native, so it's not very likely that you have a native apple or malice.
And then you've only mentioned bittersweet as if it's bad. What about the Native American as opposed to the Oriental?
So there is a native bittersweet, but my understanding is that they've hybridized now. Again, not an expert on bittersweet, and maybe Judy knows if she's still on, she could chime in. But from my understanding, it's pretty tough to tease out whether you have the American or the invasive. It's hard to find that American anymore. So if you know the source, if you're going to a nursery and you can plant it, there's nothing wrong with planting the American, but I think it's harder to find. Mm-hmm.
All right, and that does it. And it looks like we will be done before 8:30. So thank you so much, Denise. Thanks everybody who stuck around and listened to questions. And we appreciate